Welcome to Life-Changing Challengers, the podcast where passion meets purpose. I'm Brad Minus, your host, guiding you through stories of transformation and triumph, from endurance feats to overcoming adversity. Our guests defy the limits and inspire action. Ready to ignite your desire and incinerate your barriers? Join us. Your journey to the extraordinary begins now. Welcome to another episode of Life-Changing Challengers, and we are really excited today. You've got James Walters with us today. He's an author, he's an entrepreneur, he's a podcaster, he's a speaker, and he has this podcast is called A Joyful Rebellion. And he's come through quite a bit of adversity, traumatic experiences where we're going to talk about that. So James, how you doing today?
Brad, I'm doing amazing. Thank you for having me. This is going to be a really cool conversation. I'm excited for it.
Yeah, me too. So for all of you, I just mentioned that he had a podcast. We're two podcasters. And what I just found out recently is we both got serious about it at the same time. So this is going to be epic. It's going to be a lot of fun. And you can hear it, right? You can hear how great he sounds on his mic, almost as good as mine. So it's so the audio quality of this is going to be fantastic. But anyway, James, hey, can you tell us a little bit about your childhood, maybe the complement of your family, where you grew up, and what was it like to be James as a kid?
Yeah, I grew up on the East Coast in Wilmington, North Carolina. So a couple things going on. It was flat in Wilmington. It's at the beach. So there's no hills, there's no mountains. And I spent my entire childhood, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of miles I put on my bike, but I'm from that generation where from the age of probably 6 years old, I was riding my bike to school. And I can't tell my kids uphill both ways because it was flat. And the reason I keep mentioning that is because when I got to college, I moved more to the center of the state and I thought I was going to take my bike and go places. And that was a hard stop because I discovered what hills were like to bicycle up and down, and it wasn't fun. So back to childhood though, I just had a happy-go-lucky existence. I was also from that generation where your parents weren't around a lot. So I was hanging out with my friends after school, let myself in the house, get a snack, watch some Scooby-Doo, and maybe do homework a little bit. And that was growing up until around high school. When I went to high school, my high school has the claim to fame is where Michael Jordan graduated from. So that was like 10 years before me, though. So it wasn't a thing. He was just really getting famous when I was in the high school. So, but now it's all tricked out with Air Jordan stuff, like the gymnasium and everything. I went back there and it's pretty spotless and amazing. So that's cool. But I just recall a carefree element to my childhood and my growing up. I did a lot of chores. Now that I think about it. I'm the oldest of 5 kids. And I did a lot of watching 4 other little kids and until I graduated high school. The minute I graduated high school, I moved into the middle of the state, started college and was like, okay, we'll see you guys later. And that was wrapped up childhood for me.
So what was that? What was that dinner table like? Did you guys have like regular dinners where did your mom was like, okay, now listen, one time we have to sit around together as dinner time, and you guys all did that? Or was it make your own, find your own way to get your dinner? How does that work?
It's funny. I do remember really consistent dinners until probably that fourth sibling came along, and my youngest sibling was 15 years younger than me. So I had some years behind me before he came along. But once that one came along, it was like I remember a lot of Domino's pizza, a lot of Hamburger Helper.
Okay.
And just quick stuff. And there were still some sit around the table, but the table was getting pretty crowded at that point. So there was just a lot more like go grab some things. And I was also in fairness, I wasn't around a lot because I was at the age where I could be out working and I could be out of the house just a lot more under my own transportation, things like that. So yeah, the later years were definitely less sitting around the table.
I get that. Yeah. I unfortunately, I was an only child, but I am like you, a latchkey kid, exactly the same way. Come home, do my own thing. I was in band and I was playing the clarinet and the saxophone. So it was like, come home. All right. Don't do homework, practice both your instruments, blah, 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 then do homework and start dinner. And mom would come in and finish dinner and go from there. But yeah, definitely. And chores every weekend. Get out and mow the lawn, pull weeds, blah, 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 all that. But yeah, same way. Also, the bike. I was big on my bike, and now I'm an endurance coach and I help triathletes, and I do triathlon, so I'm still on my bike. But I will tell you, just so we get this out of the way, my favorite triathlon that I've done about 4 times is Ironman North Carolina 70.3, which is in Wilmington.
Okay. How about that?
Yeah, it's my favorite one. So it's beautiful scenery, great run, the run goes through the park and around and back, go up and down a little bit of hills, not really not that much hills, but the swim is great because it's downstream. So so it's awesome.
That's great.
Yeah, my favorite one by any chance of the imagination. It's just it's just a great race, done well, the whole bit. It used to be called, before Ironman bought it, used to be called Beach to Battleships.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you might have heard that. If you've ever heard, you might have saw it like sitting in a small little paper or something. But anyway, all right. So you went to school at what, UNC?
I went to a little school in Asheboro for photography. I figured out that in high school, if I really concentrated on taking photography classes, I could get out of taking certain math classes. So I even took from the community college there and locally to get high school credit because I had already maxed out all my photography classes at the high school. So I guess I was creative at a really early age to try and figure out just how to not do math. That was my real motivation. And through all the darkroom, through all of the things I learned, I really fell in love with photography and just creating different worlds, different realities through the lens. And that got me to this college, is Randolph Community College in Asheboro, is where the zoo is in North Carolina. That's what it's famous for now. But back in the 90s, it had one of the top photography programs all around the country. I had people who were in my class from Thailand, and they came there specifically to that small little town. It was a dry town. You couldn't even buy a beer there at that point. It's nuts. But yeah, I had a good photography program, and that's what I went to do. And I got out of there and went into commercial photography.
Oh my God, that's amazing. When did you get your first camera?
Oh, it would have been like one of those really cheapo Spider-Man kind of thing that took the 110 cartridge.
Yes.
And had those awful just the worst pictures ever. But I had that and I was fascinated with it, but the pictures were so bad, I just never thought much about it until high school when I went into the pawn shop and I bought this Pentax that
K1000.
The K1000, exactly.
Yeah.
And it was probably $50 at the pawn shop, and put the film in it and started developing that for the classes that I was taking. I was like, oh, I'm hooked now, because that felt real. And that felt like I could really create something that I was in control of, not just snap with a button on the side of the Spider-Man camera.
You and I have a lot more things there, because I also was in the photo club when we were in high school. And my dad, it wasn't called the K1000 because he had bought it in Germany.
Okay.
Like right when I was born, it was called the Asahi. And when they started producing them over here, they just turned around and called them the K1000. I didn't know that until I was told, someone showed me one, but I got an AE1 program.
Okay.
And so I started with that. And then
that's the one all the cool kids had. Like if you weren't.
Yeah, it literally was the same camera, the Canon's version of the K1000, just an SLR. And it was very cool. And that's how I made my beer money through college.
Nice.
I got hooked up with a guy that had a photography business where he would go to all of the Greek events and football games and stuff. And he would take pictures and he wouldn't develop them there. He would send them over to friggin' like Walmart or Walgreens or something. And he'd get the proofs, and then he'd put them inside of a photo album, and then give them to the chapters and say, okay, here's an order form. Just give me how many you want of what picture. And then he'd make them and he'd put like little things on them. Like,
That's pretty great.
yeah. Yeah. So and that's how I made my money through.
Cool.
Yeah. That was when I made my money through college. But yeah. So yeah, I didn't get creative. You know what I mean? It was pure money. And I turned that into doing some weddings over the summer when I was at home. And that did the exact same thing. I brought them into Sam's Club. They made them. And then they were also able to make my enlargements. So I would make the enlargements. I put them inside of a nice looking album, hand it over, and collect $200, and let's go.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you went into commercial photography. Did you start working for someone, or did you hang a shingle and just decided that that's what you were going to do?
No, luckily, North Carolina, this little known thing, but North Carolina has some of the largest photography studios in the world. And the reason for that is in High Point, they have the furniture market. So High Point, North Carolina, very close to the center of the state. They have been known worldwide for making furniture for many years. And a lot of the towns around there were known for that. So I'm not sure when it started, but it was well over 60 years ago. They started having all of these different manufacturers come to High Point for a market. They would showcase their goods, and it still happens in the spring and fall every year. And because of that, so many manufacturers were there. They have studios and I started working for one of those right out of school. And these are hundreds of thousands of square feet of studio space. It's like a little Hollywood. When you walk in, there's just room set that might look like a colonial house. There, you go to the next one, it looks like a Spanish villa. You go to the next one, it looks like a log cabin. And they've got carpenters, painters, professional interior designers on staff to make these rooms. Anything in ads are pretty much would come from a studio like that. You would not be able to tell that is not a real place. Wow. And so that was fascinating to me. I love just being able to create this reality from scratch. Sometimes they would bring the walls in, and we had a whole section of the building called Wall Street, and it was filled with different walls. Some were stucco walls, some were walls that had windows that looked like church cathedral. They would have stained glass in them, and they would just pull it out. They would clamp them together, and by a little after lunchtime, you had a room that looked like something. And then it was time to set up the camera, set up the lights. We even had huge pieces. It was like film, but they were huge. They were probably 5-6 feet wide and about 10 feet tall that we would put behind the windows. And it could be forest back there. It could be the beach. We could have the beach, and 10 minutes later, we could have forest. So it was really cool to be able to just, in the matter of a few minutes, change the look of something so dramatically.
That is super cool. So the company that you worked for would rent a space and then hire you to go in and take pictures
actually
with the furniture, or?
Well, actually, I worked for them full time. So this is a commercial studio. They hire, so they had a lot of photographers on staff, and I was one of those. And then what would happen is they would sell, basically like selling any photography, but a furniture company would come in and they would say, hey, we need these X number of new pieces photographed. We want the look and feel to be XYZ. They would give direction, and then we would take it from there and just set everything up and make everything look good.
Oh, okay. So you actually worked for that studio.
I did. I worked.
What a great business model.
Yeah.
Own the studio and have a bunch of different sets already ready to go and ways to change them out. And then say, hey, you got a product, you got a model, you got something, just come on in and we've got photographers ready for you. Walk out with your pictures. So the 90s, that's when we started. How was it? It was got to be the 90s when we started with digital. It was just starting.
Yeah, I started right out of school. This studio had invested heavily in digital. And back then you had to, because a camera was around $30,000. And by the way, you couldn't just hold the camera in your hand. You had to tether it to at least $10,000, $15,000 worth of computer to be able to run the camera. So, and also, by the way, you couldn't hold the camera at all because it had to be very securely on a stand, because those cameras literally took 3 pictures. It took a red, a green, and a blue picture, and then the software put those together. So nothing could be moving. And it was a wild time, but yeah, that was 94 and we were shooting digital. And it wasn't until around 90, no, not 90. It was around 2003 when we started getting the smaller cameras that you could handhold and that did not have to be tethered all the time to a computer. So it took a little while to evolve.
I'm trying to remember, because I remember my first digital camera, and it was a Sure Shot or something like that. I don't remember if it was one of the cheaper ones to start with. And it was so cool because it was like the first time you can go and see it and go, no, don't like that one, delete. Whereas before, as you're like, you got your meter and you're like, lights are just perfect. And you're looking through the lens before you're like, click, because film was expensive.
Yeah. And truly, when I started with this photography studio, we were still shooting on the big 4x5 and 8x10 cameras. So there were some days when I wasn't doing anything digital at all because some clients still didn't trust digital photography at that point. They still wanted their stuff the way they'd always done it. And for some of them, that was on big 8x10 sheets of film. And let me tell you, that was fun because it died out pretty quick. But while I was able to do it, well, it died out quick for me. For some people, they'd been doing it their whole entire career. And it looked like you were Ansel Adams or something. You had to throw the sheet over your head to black it out. And so you could see the focus. And it was super cool. And I'm bummed that people don't get to do that anymore.
Yeah, large format.
Yeah.
And that was pretty cool because I remember the first time that I got to handle a medium format camera, and I was in high school, and it was the same thing, right? It was transparencies that actually produced a positive, not a negative, a positive.
Yeah.
And that was, I remember touching that Hasselblad the first time when I went.
Yeah.
It's like when I was in the military, the first time I handled an M60. Like the M16 was not that big of a deal, but the M60, yeah, that would get you excited when you're able to touch that. But it was the same thing with that when I was able to like actually put my hands on a Hasselblad, like Hasselblad medium format. It's, oh my God, this is the coolest.
It's cool stuff. Like those things are built like a tank.
Yeah. Yeah. So, that's amazing. So how long were you doing commercial photography?
I did that for 10 years before I realized I needed to switch it up. And the great thing I've always loved about photography, I've been in it for 32 years now, is that there's so many little micro careers inside of photography. So I realized, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today is just awareness. And that's one thing that's transformed my life. But each time I can look back and I really made a big difference or change in my life, it's just been understanding and having awareness about something. And after 10 years of going to a studio, and I would work with great clients, I would tell all these different clients stories. They were all different stories. I was going to the same place every day to tell different stories, essentially, and really help people sell their stuff. But I was also telling stories through photographs. And I got bored of it after about 10 years. And when I was in school, it was in the early 90s, and something that was really looked down upon if you felt like you were going to be a serious photographer. I got air quotes up for anybody who's not watching us right now. But if you were going to be serious, you were either going to go into photojournalism, you were going to go into commercial. But what you weren't going to do is go be a wedding photographer, because that's what you did if you weren't maybe struggling to have creativity or something like that. I don't know what would be the nicest way to say that, but in the 90s, wedding photography wasn't that interesting. It was just some people in really nice clothes standing beside each other with their hands folded over and smiling. And then you call it a day. And so I knew I would never become a wedding photographer. And I know now with some wisdom, you never say never. because I realized that's the challenge I needed, where for 10 years I'd gone to the same place and I had total control over absolutely every facet of that photograph. If I felt like the light was coming in a little too harsh, I would tone it down. If I felt like there was a highlight on something, I would adjust it. And I realized that I needed to put myself in a situation where I had a whole lot less control, but at the same time still had to produce great images. And lucky for me, right around 2004, two things were happening. Digital cameras were getting handheld to where they would produce good quality, and at the same time didn't cost $12,000 anymore. They cost about $6,000 to get a good one, but still that wasn't 12. So it was getting better. It was going in the right direction anyway. And the second thing that happened, and I think this is a byproduct of things going more digital, is clients were getting really excited about wedding photography that looked more like it was supposed to be in a magazine than people in really nice clothes looking bored and stiff and just all lined up in a row. So those two things got me interested in photographing weddings, which before I would have told you, no, I'll never do that. And there I was. I spent 15 years specializing in weddings because I got so addicted to the unpredictability of it. And at the same time, having to deliver. It was just a complete pendulum swing from what I'd been used to. Now I was not going to the same place every day telling different stories. I was going to wildly different places all the time. And I was telling the same story, because a wedding has a formula to it, right? It's got a pretty set format. So I was telling the same story for different people in different locations. And my challenge was to tell it in different ways that matched the personality of that person, not just make it cookie cutter. And also, maybe the groom shows up late. Maybe the bridesmaid slipped the bride some Xanax before, and she'd never taken it but she was a little nervous. And so the bridesmaid was like, here, this helps me. And having to deal with those things and having to figure out, okay, the show must go on. How are we going to do this? And not that it was all on me, but that really did happen too. And with the bride, and luckily she made it down the aisle, but for a little while there, it was touch and go. She would just stare at the wall for about 2 hours before the wedding. And it all worked out, but we got stories.
Man, I can't even imagine. I didn't do it very, very long. I did like the summers of college.
Yeah.
And I'd make enough with like 4 or 5 weddings and I was done. But that was when I tried to do the same thing, actually, because it was this, after a couple of them, you're like, all right, what can I do differently?
Oh, yeah.
So, but yeah, never had that issue. It was pretty much everything always went pretty smoothly. But what I wouldn't have given to have like cool stories like that. Now, when I did Greek photography, that's a whole different story. That I could tell you some pretty wild stories, but that's bad. But 15 years in something that you never thought that you would do.
Absolutely. That's why I never say never anymore. I try to tone that down, because you just don't know how I changed a little bit. The world changed a little bit to make that come together. So I think if the world hadn't changed in the fact that the work was getting a little more what I would call editorial and people were going for that. And then if I had to shoot film, because I did start out shooting film, I would maybe shoot like 200 pictures total, because every time you hit that button, it was $1 to get the proof, to get the film, all that stuff. And then with digital, you could experiment. You could get a little crazy and you would get your safe shot and you're like, okay, I see my safe shot. Looks great. Let's do something that fills my cup creatively. And if you had to work it out a few times and see it on the back of the camera until you like what you saw, great. And then when the client saw it, they were like, whoa, I've never seen anything like this. And that was really just the ability to experiment and color outside the lines without it costing every single time you hit that button.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that too, is where close-ups, like really solid close-ups, macro photography of the bouquet, and like getting down at the level of the cake and going across and looking at it like it almost looked like it was a runway.
Yeah.
When you were parallel with the cake when it was flat, at the flat at the top, or looking up. All these crazy angles that you could get. And if they liked them, great. If you didn't, well, that's fine. It didn't cost me anything to show them a proof. And then did you do, so you were able to do like video proofs too, right? You were able to like, well, I don't know what it was early in your career, but I'm a little later on, you probably was able to put them online and say, go take a look and see which ones you want.
Early in the career, like the first thing they would see would be a video slideshow that was set to music. So it was I would send them a DVD,
Okay.
and they would pop it in, and essentially they would see all of and these were still pictures. They weren't video, but they were presented in a way that was slideshow format, and it was just entertaining. They would sit down for about an hour and look at maybe 800, 850 of their pictures. They would see them all in the order they happen. And then we would start talking about, okay, you've seen the pictures, you've enjoyed them. Now let's talk about what to do with them. And that was also about the time when the technology was coming on to be able to post a gallery.
Right.
And it wasn't easy back then. And the whole point was you post it and people would buy prints. Still, it was very much a paper print centric ecosystem. But yeah, those were coming on to where you could at least do that without having to have someone come over and look at physical proofs anymore.
Send them to the gallery. They use their little checkbox. The checkbox would come up. They'd say, okay, I want an 8x10 of this. I want 4x5s of this. I want 2 3x5s of this. I want some 6x8s. I want blah, blah, blah. And then you would do, and then what was about the time? Because I don't remember, but was there a time where things like shifted from they still wanted they wanted their wedding album to all they were cool with the DVD of their wedding?
Yeah, I would say that was, oh man, I want to say that was probably around 2007.
Okay, so
it was about the time the millennials started getting married. I would mark it there because prints weren't as big a deal, and they were a big deal to the parents. So you started to see that divide where the clients were asking, oh, I really don't care about an album. I just want the digitals. My parents will probably get an album, and my parents might get some prints. So yeah, that did necessitate a completely different business model than what had been going on in the past. So yeah, that in those years, of course, that was the economic crash times too. So yeah, right around there was not only a generational shift in the people who were getting married at that point, but it was also just, I guess, maybe a whole mindset shift just economically. So it did change the industry.
Wow. I'm just curious, as I've never done it full time before. So how many weddings do you think you did in a year?
Oh, wow. So it was pretty consistent, like in the heyday. It was pretty consistent around 35. Like 06 was the max year ever at 60.
Wow.
And I did not sleep very much that year. It was a good year. Not mad about it, but that was the year where I think I did on Memorial Day, for example, you did a Friday, you did a Saturday, and you did a Sunday wedding because people were off work on Monday and they could do a Sunday wedding. So it was that kind of stuff. But also back then, there weren't as many photographers in the world. So there were people who I would travel all over the place because I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, but Charleston, South Carolina is not very far away. It's 4 hours from here if you drive. And that was a huge destination. People would bring me down there all the time because there weren't a ton of photographers. Now there's no point because there are so many great photographers right around Charleston, unless they really love me and they're like, I see something that you do that I cannot get around here. That used to happen back 10, 12 years ago. And that doesn't happen as much. And I think that's cool because it's elevated it in some ways. It's elevated the profession. In some ways it's not, but
Yeah.
it all balances out.
Yeah. The phones getting really good cameras.
Yeah.
Really started to do some crazy stuff, but it brought out photographers of people that never thought they were photographers because the barrier to entry became very tiny. When you and I started, because I did, when I was in high school, I built a dark room with my friends. And every time we had to ask for more developer, more paper, oh my God, God forbid the light went out in the enlarger.
Oh, yeah.
Because you had to bring the enlarger to the shop because you couldn't replace it yourself. Oh, especially being a high school kid.
Right.
But oh my God, yeah. And it was, so every time I would turn around, oh, I need more developer. And they're like, parents are like, you guys can't be doing this all the time because we would spend hours and hours in the darkroom just to see what we could do.
Yeah. Because it's so fun. It was magic. It was the next best thing to alchemy. You're just creating something out of almost nothing.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. But so that's 15 years. So that only gets us to 2019. What happened at that point?
Well, actually, there was the thing that sort of shifted everything for me happened right after the 2008, 2009 period. And so that was the time in my life where I was at the top of the game with weddings and just crushing it every single weekend. And then just a series of events started happening in my personal life. Professionally, everything could not have been better. It was smooth sailing and I was having a blast. Personally, people around you get to a certain age, and as you yourself grow older, everyone around you does too. And the people who are significantly older than you, like your grandparents, they don't last forever. And so that was the period in my life where the first thing that happened, this was in 2008, was I had a brother who overdosed. And so he died. That kind of sent some shockwaves through the family. It was not wildly unexpected, but at the same time, you don't know how you're going to handle something when it actually happens. And so I was always the steady person, low on the drama, emotion, that kind of thing. So I found myself watching as a lot of members of my family unraveled because of that. It wasn't far behind that, like 3 months, my grandmother, who I was really close to, she died because she was at that age where you do that. So again, not wildly unexpected, but another hit, just 3 months. And it wasn't long after that, let's see, just 4 months after that, that my daughter was born. And so that was supposed to be joyful, right? But the issue there is that was also the time that the economy was teeter-tottering on the brink of destruction. And I was starting to feel it in the business. So you got this separate thing with people dying around me. That's not happening to me, but it's happening around me, certainly affecting what's going on. Then you got the business element where I'm like, okay, we don't know what the future looks like. Both my wife and I worked for the photography company. We were both self-employed. So then you got this new little bundle of joy coming along that don't know if anybody out there doesn't know this. Babies are wildly expensive. And so, yeah, that produced a little bit of stress. And so our daughter was born. That was in July. And the day after she was born, we were still in the hospital and all the good stuff going on there. And then we got the call that my wife's grandfather had passed the day after. And so we weren't able to go there, be there. We were in the hospital, just recover, or my wife was recovering. And so we got home a couple of days later, went straight to a funeral with a brand new baby. And it was just one thing after another like that for the span of about 3 years. And so from 2008 to 2011, it was pretty much one thing after another, very similar. More grandparents died. My mom, it was one of those things. And I found myself stressed out, bummed out, and just still having to or still feeling like I need to be performing at 110% at work, because as I look back on it, I was using work to numb myself out from everything else that was going on. And I thought, well, if I'm being productive and it is actually my responsibility to take care of my family, and I do that through providing through this work I do, that made me feel good about it. And so I checked out of every other part of life. I was still showing up at work a lot, and way too much, actually, which started to affect relationships, right? Because that's how that works. If you don't have balance, the wheels are going to fall off at some point in whatever area you don't have the balance in. So it was probably around the end of 2012, 2013, we're getting into 2013 now, when I realized that my marriage and everything, because of those prior years, me checking out, me not being the best version of me, well, now I'd done irreparable damage to that relationship, which I thought, as a guy, I think in my podcast, I've heard this over and over, guys think, oh, well, we can fix it, right? I'll turn my attention here and we'll focus on it and we'll get this fixed and it'll be all better. And some things you can't fix. And as men, I think we scratch our heads and we're like, what do you mean? I got duct tape. We can't fix anything.
Right.
Until we're presented with evidence to the contrary. And that's what I was presented with in right around 2013. And so that threw me into this just complete identity crisis, because we had been married. We got married young. We got married at 20 years old, and we owned a business together for the last 10 of those years. And so our identities were wrapped up in the work we did with each other and the relationship we had with each other for the better part of all of our lives, over half of our lives at that point. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, who am I now? I'm not this thing I always said I was or thought I'd be. So it was a crisis of identity. And it was also me realizing that I was in just a depression, like a low level, high functioning depression. I wasn't happy about anything. And I realized I needed to do something about it, because this can't be life. This can't be all there is to life. So I started reading all these self-help books. I reading books about happiness. And it was probably the fourth or fifth book about happiness that I read. And I'm realizing, okay, this isn't working. And then I thought about, okay, what do all of these books have in common? And I could never figure it out, but these big, thick books, like 200 pages each, telling you how you can be more happy, and all these psychological studies and things that people have done over the years. And what they all boil down to is you just have to decide to be. And I was like, well, that's terrible, because I'm having trouble with that. And the other part that they all boil down to is you have to do things. You have to decide that you're going to be happy, but you also have to decide to do things that are going to allow you to feel that way. And when I brought those two things together, the deciding and then the doing, that's when things really started to get magical again for me, because it was like reading another book's not going to do it. And it wasn't till I don't want to say discovered it, but that's what it was. I discovered, oh, it's all on me. I've got to do this. Can't just read about it. I can read about how to fix a car, but unless I fix the car, it's still broken, right? So I was the car I had to fix. And when I started working on myself, when I started really putting that investment of time, that investment, getting out of my comfort zone in the ways that I realized I just wasn't able to check out by working anymore, that's when things started to turn around. And that's when creativity started to go way up. happiness. I lost the relationship, that was, and there's a certain amount of, you just got to accept it, and then you got to move on. And there's a certain amount of, I guess, comfort in that, just knowing, okay, the future is unknown. But if we think about it, it always is unknown. It's never really known. And once I got comfortable with that fact, then I was able to get things going again.
Serenity, man. It's absolute serenity. And the serenity prayer has the stereotypical, it's linked with recovery. It's linked with addiction, right? But if you actually listen to the words and you actually say the words, it's good for everybody, right? God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? So it looks like that's where you were starting to begin. And then, of course, you realized, and this is like, I'm just totally mirroring back, is the ability that you read all this stuff, but you didn't execute anything that was in the books. You didn't apply them. Right. When you finally realized that, hey, if I apply some of this stuff, this could actually work. So that's my question. What are some of the first things that you started to apply that started that journey back to joy?
That's the part that I love the most, because they were all really simple things. And the first thing that I stumbled on in all of this, because you're right about reading the books, I just on subconscious level, I was thinking, okay, I'll read this book and I'll feel better, like it's a book of spells or something. But it's not a book of spells. It's just information, and information's useless if you don't do anything with it. So that was the first thing, is do something. So I was really intentional about setting goals that were going to fill my cup, not necessarily professional goals. I'd always had a lot of professional goals, and let's, grind. I was really good at the grind. And what I had to do was turn that off, or turn it way down. So I turned it way down, and I figured out, okay, now I didn't have any hobbies. People are like, what do you do for fun? What are you talking about? And I had to figure out, okay, what does James do for fun now? Because I need to do something. And that's when I started writing. And that's also when I started doing projects that were, I call them micro adventures. And I love micro trips. I love micro adventures. I'll go to a new town and just walk around and explore it for a day, a weekend. And luckily I've got a lot of cool places around that I've never discovered around here. So I started doing that. The other thing that I stumbled onto in the course of all the research that I did was the philosophy of Stoicism. And if you know anything about Stoicism, it predates Christianity. It's like 3 or 4,000 years old, but it's a Greek philosophy. And there are a lot of famous Greek and Roman philosophers who adopted it. And so it's not a religion at all. It's simply a philosophy. And one of the main components of it is you cannot really control anything except for your thoughts. You can't control your feelings, but you can control how you think about your feelings. You can control whether or not you question your feelings, in other words. And even in more modern times, a good quote by Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book called The Man's Search for Meaning.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah. His famous quote is, between stimulus and response, there's a little pause that you're in total control of what you do or how you think about an issue. So in essence, I started realizing that in the world, there's nothing that is good or bad. Everything is pretty neutral until we judge it as good or bad, or until we judge it as helpful to us or not, or until we judge it dangerous or useful. And so when I started to look at the world through that lens, I started to really care a whole lot less about things that didn't involve me. And I also started to realize that most things don't involve me. And once that was really eye-opening, and it was really powerful, because things that I would be stressed out about that I've thought I was responsible for, had responsibility, they didn't care about me. Why should I care about it? We didn't have anything to do with each other in so many instances. And when I really started thinking about, okay, what am I responsible for and how can I do that the best? Then I was focusing my energy on the right stuff. And not only that, I was starting to see the payoff. And the payoff, in my opinion, was good, because the payoff's neutral until you give it a judgment. And the judgments always come through our perceptions of what's good and bad. So once I broke life down in those terms, things got pretty cool.
I can only imagine. So I wish more people would take on some of the philosophy of Stoicism, even if it's just portions of it, because the amount of stress that goes around with things that have nothing to do with anybody, or things that will not change their lives in the least, people get really stressed out about. Political climates, all of a sudden things happen and elections go different ways, and all of a sudden you got one side that's just absolutely crazy, nutty. If you see some of these things that are the rants that go on social media, it's just ridiculous that people feel that strongly about it. And if you really go back, if these people really would go back and think about their lives, it's not gonna do a dang thing for them. All 4 years of what they think is going to be the worst. Them personally, most of them, 80, 90%, it is not going to mean a dang thing either way.
No.
And that's so that I think is a positive there, right? I would think that, you tell me if I'm off here. If you want to take on a fight, that's certainly your choice. You want to take on a certain fight. Okay. But you allow yourself to be affected because that's your fight. You've got a dog in the fight, versus it's something that's going on around you, but most likely is not going to affect you in the least.
Right. And that's a huge part. And Stoicism is about taking action. Stoicism, a large component of it is about justice. So if you see injustice, you do want to take action if it's appropriate. Because the only thing we can control is ourselves, our words and our actions. So we can't control the outcome. And if there is an injustice, and if you do want to do something about it, definitely take action, but don't get bummed out when it doesn't go your way. Your voting example or the election example is a great component of that. Is if someone says, yes, I want this future for myself and my family, well, the action is to go vote. And if you've done your action and it doesn't go your way, okay, you did everything you could do, and now just go about your life. Go do something that is going to add to your life and people around you.
I get it. That's the way I think people should be thinking. It's like, really take a look around, really look at what is stressing you out, and figure out how much of it does it actually affect you.
Yeah.
Right. And when you really look about it, it's the only things that you take action on are what's going to affect you. Right.
Yeah.
So I want to step back real quick, because I totally missed the story of, and I just, you could do a 30,000 foot view, is when did you meet your, I'm going to say, is it first wife or is it wife period?
Wife. Yeah. Wife. So, well,
you said you were 20.
We were 20 when we got married. We met on the playground of 6th grade. We were both 12.
Okay.
And we were both gross to each other. Obviously, we were in 6th grade, so ew. But 2 years later, we were in junior high, and the opposite sex becomes a little less gross around that age, around 15. We were 14, 15 at that point. And so we dated for you didn't date in 8th grade. You went together. I don't even know what they call it anymore, but which means you basically tease each other on the playground for maybe 2 weeks and or what it wasn't a playground in 8th grade, but it was the schoolyard.
Right.
And so, yeah, that was brief. And then maybe a year later, we were like, okay, let's have a summer romance and going into the 9th grade. And before long, we were pretty much dating throughout high school. And then we both went off to separate colleges, separate cities, and 18 years old, you're going to find yourself. And so we broke up for a little while, and that went okay for maybe 8-9 months till we realized, no, we really like each other. And by the time college was over, we were walking down the aisle, getting married.
See, that's such a sweet story. That's such a great story. So then now, so you brought her into the business with you once you got done with the commercial side, right? Or did
Actually, she didn't work there. She worked in a completely separate industry. And it was when we had our first child, and that was in 2003.
Okay.
And she said, if we're ever going to do something, because we had always been talking about going into our own company, into our own business for photography and doing weddings. And she said, if we're ever going to do it, we should probably go ahead and do it while it's scary now, because after the baby's born, it's going to be even scarier. And so she was really the one who pulled me into the business.
Oh.
And yeah, so she was trailblazing back then, and she jumped in. She did all of the business stuff. I did most of the creative stuff. So I got the work out there and got the work sold. She managed everything. And we were a great team for a long time.
Yeah, it sounds that way. So when all this stuff started to happen and you were getting hit with tragedy left and right, and this was the whole thing, and you said that you dove into work. Now she's part of your work.
Yeah.
So she's still seeing you every day, but yet you're finding yourself drifting apart.
Yeah, we really there was a point there where we were business partners more than a married couple. And I remember we would even industry things, we would divide and conquer those. So we wouldn't show up necessarily at industry events together. Like she would take this group because, again, we had kids at home at that point. So I would stay at home with the kids while she went to one industry event. She would stay at home with the kids while I would go to this different one. So we divided and conquered. And over several years of that, plus all the other stress, we just realized that we were no longer functioning as a married couple. We were functioning okay as parents. We were functioning okay as business partners. But as a married couple, the way things probably should have looked, we weren't putting the effort and the focus on that because we were fighting fires on so many other fronts.
That's just, I don't know what to say about that. It's just
a bummer, man.
Yeah, you're basically business partners, roommates, and co-parents.
Yeah.
And that's the way it was. Now, so you had mentioned that there was a certain point where things started to fall apart. Did it actually fall apart? Did you end up getting a divorce, or are you?
We did, yes. And so there came a part where, like I was saying, I thought, okay, we'll fix it. We'll do the therapy. We'll do the things that people do when they're having this. And for me, I was so checked out for a lot of years that I didn't realize all the neglect and damage that had been done to that part of the relationship. And there just came a point where she said, look, you're too late on this, because her cup was so empty. And looking back, I get it. I totally get it. But I was still in that mindset, oh, things can be fixed. And she was like, yeah, no, I don't think you're hearing me. And so that's when I realized that, okay, they can't be fixed. Let's just do this in the best way possible. And so that's when I started going through my journey of trying to figure out, okay, who am I now? What am I about? Like, how am I going to keep going? And how am I going to keep going without this really feeling like crap every single day? And so that was the end of that relationship was kind of the beginning of my journey that I'm on now.
And the kids were what, like 11 and 12 at that point?
One was 5. So daughter was 5 at that point, and which would make my son 10. So he's 21 now. So,
nice.
And you asked me about UNC. He is attending UNC now. So he's just down the road.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So yeah, that's got to be tough. So you're going through this journey, you're co-parenting. Did she end up with full custody, or did you do 50-50?
I told someone yesterday who I've known for years, because I'll see her at jobs that I do, photography jobs, and she's in the event planning space now. So we do work together sometimes, and someone asked me, well, is that weird? And I was like, no, we've always been great business partners, more than we were a married couple. And that kind of goes back to the parenting stuff. We didn't really have any formal arrangement. The kids, one of them lives at college now, but the other one is back and forth whenever. We don't have like a certain day she's got to be anywhere. I pick her up from school about half the time, and get to see her that way. So we don't have a formal arrangement. We just do it as needed, because like she might be out traveling, I might travel, and then we just work it like that. So there wasn't that animosity. There wasn't any, I don't know, stuff I've heard about with other people. We just didn't have that. We didn't have that drama, and we've never been drama people. We're pretty chill. So thankful for that.
But yeah, that's great. That's a fantastic model, is just the idea that, hey, listen, we're just going to work it out. And that's it.
Yeah.
Hey, you know what? I got this thing coming up. I'd like to take one of my kids. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine.
Oh yeah. That's how I was telling the whole time.
Or I'm going out of town. Can you take them? Yeah, great. That's fantastic. That's probably the best thing ever, compared to a lot of people that I've talked to where it's been fights and, oh my God. I think some of the people that I've interviewed, I give you some like horror stories when it goes around custody of the kids. It is awful. So yeah, I got to give you kudos for that.
I think the fact that we were business owners, and so we understood, like, when you've got to work, that is important. And if you can get around it and be with the kids, cool. But if you can't and you have to work, like, that is what provides for the kids and your lifestyle and things like that. So we were both in that world for long enough that we understand that need for flexibility from the other parent. And whenever I hear people who don't, it seems to be people who maybe have a job that's a little more rigid in its schedule and inflexible, and they need that comfort of knowing that they have a set schedule that they can repeat out into eternity. I don't know if that's the deal, but I think that was one of the really big factors for us to just be able to say, hey, we'll deal with the holidays, we'll deal with vacations as they come up, and it's all good. We both know what team we're on when it comes to making sure the kids get what they need. So,
and it's the best thing for the kids.
Yeah.
Right.
Hopefully. We'll see. Time will tell.
Well, it sounds like you're just about empty nesters to both of you. So you're getting close, but that's great. Great college. And so you got to be proud of your son. Your daughter's is probably not too far away. So that's great. So give me a typical day now that you've found your rebellious journey into joyfulness.
Yeah.
What is a typical day like now? What do you wake up? Do you have a morning routine that you do to keep the happiness rolling, or are you doing the same thing you do with your kids? It's just willy-nilly.
No, I've got
I'm totally kidding.
No, yeah. So it's not every day I wake up the exact same time, but it's typically around 5:30-ish. And I'm a photographer, I'm a visual person, so I don't have an auditory alarm clock, but I do have my I'm not going to say her name, but we all know who she is from Amazon, the little box, and she turns on the lights in my bedroom. And so there's no noise. There's just all of a sudden light on in my bedroom. And then I know it's time to go jump in the shower, get things going for the day. But I do have a pretty tight morning routine. I sit down, I make myself coffee, and I pour the first cup. While that first cup is cooling off, I will look at my to-do list. I keep an old school, just pad of paper for the couple of tasks that have to get done that day. I like to tactile, just write it out longhand, and even more so love to cross it off when I'm finished with it. So that's
huge. A lot of studies have said that the dopamine rush that you get from going the absolute pen to paper down is so much bigger than you going to your phone and going click.
Yeah.
So it gives you a dopamine rush, but it's not that same as going.
And I have absolutely tried the other way too, of making, and it's so easy to make your list too long if it's on digital on your phone. But if it's on a piece of paper, you say, whoa, there, you can't possibly, you're either going to overwhelm yourself or you're going to, like, what are you going to do with this huge list? So I try to keep it short, but then I go from that to I have a journal right beside me. And the most powerful thing, if anyone gets anything out of this conversation, I want to tell them the thing I learned about journaling. And I never thought I was going to be a journaler. I was like, what's the point? Who needs to read my thoughts? Until I realized I need to read my thoughts. And I don't need to read them. I don't need to read last week's thoughts. I need to read last year's thoughts. And it was during COVID. I'd read this book. It's called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. Sounds like you've heard of it.
Well, what was funny was I was about to ask you about that. And I wish I could show you the screen because I couldn't remember the exact title. And I'm like, I know it's something way. And I was like, and I literally looked it up because I was going to ask you about it. I've got it sitting here on this screen.
That's awesome.
I swear to God, it is right here. The Artist's Way, A Spiritual Path to Higher Creativity by Julia Cameron, because I have it myself. And I was like, oh, I'm going to ask him about this.
Yeah. And
here, swear to God.
And here's the thing. I read that book in probably 2016 and I dropped off about halfway through because it does start to talk a lot about spirituality. And I just wasn't there in my head in 2016. I was I was reading all these books about happiness. I was like, I've got no time to think about the creator or any of the stuff she starts talking about. But the thing that really stuck with me is she spends the first part of the book talking about just writing one page a day. And I was like, okay, that's achievable. I could do that. And I found out at age 40, I have attention deficit disorder, because I went to therapy and the lady was like, have you ever considered you might have ADD? And I was like, no, because that's fate. That's what all the kids have so they can misbehave. And she's like, no, actually, you may want to do some research. And she was nice about it. She was gentle, but that's a whole nother rabbit hole that I had to work out, which I have without medicine. So that's been cool. But with the morning pages is what Julie calls them.
The morning pages.
You just write one page and you start at the top, just spit out whatever's on your brain. Doesn't even matter. It can, like, some days I was like, oh, the coffee is really cool and the traffic outside sounds like the ocean if I think about it the right way. And I would get to the bottom and sometimes I'd say, I really don't have anything more to say. And then some days I would talk about things that would frustrate me. And some days I would talk about hopes and dreams if I was in that kind of a mood. But that's all it was. And what I suggest to people is if you can't write a page, like my journal is 8.5 by 11, it's a standard size page. And if that seems like a lot to you, get a smaller journal.
Right.
Just get a smaller page and fill her up and put the date on the top. And then, so backtracking, it was 2016 when I read that book. It wasn't until 2020 when I and the rest of the world had nothing else to do that I really started incorporating journaling into my morning practice. Because I had a morning practice that whole time. I do about 10 minutes of meditation. I do the coffee. That's important. And I look over the list of things I have to do that day. And I look at my calendar to see what commitments I have, like time-based commitments. So I make sure that I'm prepared for those. And when I incorporated journaling in 2020, because I had so much more time now, I just kept that practice up. And here's what I want everyone to hear from this is it wasn't until a year and a half later when one day I had extra time, and must have been a weekend or something. And I said, you know what? I'm going to flip back. Like I just flipped back a just random amount of pages. It's like, I'm going to read what I was doing back here in March. Let's say it was November of the following year. And I read it and I was like, I'll be darned. I'm talking about the same thing that I just wrote down on this morning's page in like 11 months ago. Why is that the case? And so I shuffled some more pages and I looked at it and I was like, oh my gosh, that I was talking about a goal that I wanted to hit. I was trying to get my black belt in karate, and I was talking about it 11 months ago, and I was still talking about that in that time frame that I just written that morning's journal entry. I was like, dude, I'm obviously just on a hamster wheel here. And so I had to have a pretty tough conversation with myself. Like, is this what you're going to write next year? Do we just want to go ahead and fill this in for next year and say, oh, I'm hoping to get my black belt? So it was not too many months that I buckled down, got that black belt, checked that off my bucket list for life, and was like, okay, it was such a teachable moment to go back and see that I was living the same year over and over, at least 2 years in a row. And that snapped me out of that habit so quick, because now if I feel like I'm talking in my morning pages about the same thing a couple of times, I know I have to focus on it and just get it done or let it go. That's an option. And so I've had to really teach myself, okay, letting something go is an option, or just get it done, which is how I finished my second book about 2 months ago.
Nice. That's crazy. And I were the same way. And by the way, at 40, I was diagnosed with ADD as well.
We need to
no, it was crazy. What would happen was I would be sitting working on something, or I'd do something and I could focus, but it'd be in very small spurts. And I'd be like daydreaming, and I look down and I'm like, oh, I need a pen. And I go into the office and I would come out of the office for 3 hours. Because I would find something else sitting there. I'm like, oh, wait, what's that? Oh, that's cool. The shiny thing. And like, oh my God, it's 3 hours. I got to get this work done. And I'd go back to the desk, or where I was. A lot of times it was on it's the kitchen counter. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, wait, I went there. Oh, I needed a pen. I didn't bring back the pen.
That's what it was. Yeah.
And you're like, all right, go back in there. And you're like, don't look at the shiny stuff. Don't look at the shiny stuff. Don't look at the shiny stuff. Just get the pen and get out of there. Sometimes it would work. Sometimes it wouldn't. But yeah, that's when I was like, yeah, something's wrong here. This happens way too much. I'm not getting anything done. And yeah, so I get it.
It sounds like we need to start a support group or something.
Right. You know what? I bet you there's something on Facebook if you want to look, but I don't know how good that would be, but yeah, no, that's just nuts. But that's great. So I got to give, as far as that example that you gave, you got to give yourself a little bit of slack, because it was the pandemic. I don't know what dojo was going to be open during that time that you were going to be able to get your black belt. So
I think the biggest thing was it's typically a 4-year trajectory to go from white belt. And this was a promise I made my younger self, to go back in my 40s and get my black belt, because when I was 8 years old, my uncle started to take Taekwondo. He was in his 20s at that point, and I was a little kid, and he was like, come along. And so we would go on the weekends, and eventually I got like 2 belts away from black belt, and then he joined the military. And so I didn't really have a ride anymore, and it was easy enough to not bug my parents and just let that fall away. And so when I got into my 40s, I was like, you know what? I'm going to keep a promise to that little kid that was me, and I'm going to go get that black belt. And so I started, and then usually takes about 4 years. 2020 was year 6, and I was still screwing around. I wasn't going to all the classes and stuff that I should have been. And it was shut down for the first few months, but then they figured out some things to do. So it wasn't completely like out of line. But yeah, it was October of that year of 2020 that I was able to finally get that black belt.
Well, congratulations on that. Yeah. I was 17 and I got my red belt in Taekwondo. And then I found this other subject that I really loved. It was called girls. Yeah, it was girls. And away from it. And then I went and finished when I was in college. So we have that in common as well. So that's super interesting. But yeah, that's nuts. Wow. But see, so you got your black belt, you wrote a book, and that's the meditation of the mundane.
It is. Yeah. This little guy,
There you go.
Just came in about a month and a half ago, got all the copies. And yeah, that was a 7-year thing. That was another one of those things that I was writing in that journal. Like, hey, I wrote some stuff down on the meditations book. And from the time that I started the project until I got these finished books, I would do a little here, do a little there. There was no urgency. And of course, this isn't something I'm getting paid for. This was one of those hobbies that I was talking about. I need to do something for me. And I just realized, you know what? I really want this to happen, and I want it to happen so I can feel good about it, but also put something out in the world that people can enjoy. And it's never going to happen if I just keep sitting here journaling about how I hope it's going to happen. It's like reading those happiness books and hope I get happy. I got to do the work. So I did the work. Yeah.
So, all right. So you have got that. Now you've got another book that's coming out soon called Plotting Your Joyful Rebellion. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But then you started 2000, let's move to 2023, and you decided to start podcasting. How did that come about?
Well, I needed a whole different level of hobby, but the thing about being a photographer is I get to dip in and out of people's lives, and I get to take photos. And I've always been fascinated about that because people can be super interesting, or some people can be super boring, but do things that are super interesting to me. And so as a photographer, I get to go in, learn a little bit about their story, maybe spend a couple of hours with them, get the photographs, and then I'm done. I'm back to my life. Podcasting is a lot like that as well, where you get to have a conversation with someone, get to know their perspective, which I love. I just love to understand how and why people think the way they do. And especially people who have overcome something big in their life. That's something you and I both love to talk to people about. And the way it came about with A Joyful Rebellion is the experience that I went through in my life was a wake-up call, in the sense that I was just floating along in life. Things were working out fine, but things weren't always working out the way I wanted them to. And until I realized that's just how life is, it wasn't making me happy. But there was also a certain element where I realized that I was in a movie. Like, my whole life was a movie, and I felt like someone else wrote the script to the movie. It wasn't me. And then I thought, every movie I've ever watched, someone wrote the script to that. And then there were actors that came in, they acted out that script. And I thought to myself, what if I'm the one that writes the script for the next chapter of my movie or book, or whatever you want to call whatever this play we call life is. And when I started thinking and framing what was going to happen next for me, what were my next actions, when I started framing them that way, I thought, you know what? This kind of feels risky. This feels a little rebellious, because in some ways I had to go against a lot of things I'd been taught as a kid. Save your money, which that's all good advice. But A Joyful Rebellion, when I thought about that podcast, I thought, so many people I know have gone through an experience like I did. So I'm not unique in that. And so many people that I knew were high achievers. And when they got to where they thought success was going to be, whether that was a specific bank account number or a specific house in the right zip code in town, or when their kids got into a certain school, or whatever it was that they thought success was going to be, and they looked around and they felt a little empty, And they had to ask themselves, okay, like I've checked all the boxes. I've worked my butt off my entire life. I got the job. I've got the wife. I've got the picket fence. I've got the car. Like why don't I feel amazing? And I had a lot of friends like that. And the joyful rebellion part is, okay, what do you do next? You've checked all the boxes that other people told you were going to make you look, appear, and feel successful. But if you only look and appear successful, but you don't feel it, you got to figure that out. And that's what the podcast hopes to do. Is I talk to people every week who have either been through that experience and they work their way out of it, or they help other people work their way out of their own experiences. And so those conversations are always fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. And that's literally, we almost have the same podcast just in a different way. I'm, like you said, you're looking for people that have an issue and then they get out of it. Mine is the same thing. They've had some adversity, trauma, injury, something, and then they had to work their way out of it in a certain way, just like you did, right? You went through it. You actually, you lost a lot of people, had tragedy after tragedy. It brought you down into this funk. You worked your way into divorce and heartache and everything else. But then you found a direction, a journey that would bring you back to a point where you were doing more and you found your own happiness. So that's exactly what this is. My other thing is that I love for people to do things that are external to what they're doing in their life. So, and oh my God, hey, audience members, if you want to skip ahead, because I'm going to tell the story again. So one of the stories that I continually talk about is somebody, her name, we call her Kat. She was 5'1" and she was 280 pounds. And she tried all the regular stuff. And she just, at one point, she turned on the television, she saw the world championships of the Ironman. And she goes, wow, that's really cool. That's really cool looking. And she started doing some research, and she was a great researcher. And she's like, oh, you know what? That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do an Ironman triathlon right there. Now, instead of doing the normal, where she would, all right, I'm going to go and get a dietitian. I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to work off this weight. Then I'm going to start this, blah, blah, blah. She went, nope. And she just started, learned to swim, had a little bit of a biking background as far as mountain biking goes, had a little bit of a running background. That was years ago. Yeah. And she goes, well, that's what I'm going to do. So the goal isn't to lose weight, get fit, get tone, all this other things. The goal is to get to that start line and finish the race. So she did all the other stuff on the way. She dropped weight. She learned about how to fuel her body the right way, all that on the way to getting to her ultimate goal. So the goal is always in the head. Get to the start line, get to the finish line, get to the start line, get to the finish line. That's what it's all about. So it's something that way out of her comfort zone, way out of something she never would have thought she'd ever done.
Yeah.
And yet 18 months after that point, she stood on the beach at 120 pounds in a size small wetsuit. And she finished the race in 11 hours and 35 minutes, which is unheard of for a first time.
Wow.
Usually first time is 13, 14, 15 hours. Well, she did it in 11:35. You know what I mean? And she looked amazing, and it was crazy. So those are the things. I've had people that have just out of the clear blue sky said, I'm going to go climb Mount Everest, figure out a plan to get there. And all those little goals that they wanted to learn how to do, like one of them learned to journal, because they wanted to make sure that not only what they were doing was they were journaling their weight, their food, how they felt, but then it just became a life of its own. They started doing other things. They started writing more stuff, and all of a sudden this became this journaling. So started out doing food, weight, temperature, blood pressure, whatever. And then all of a sudden just kept writing. And all of a sudden now they got journaling. Now they're journaling. And then the act of getting up in the morning to go work out developed this habit of now fitness, right? Which they carried even after their race. Now it's like, well, I've been doing it. I'm just going to keep doing it. And just do it for me.
That's the life now.
But unless you're like me and I need that race, but I'm self-aware enough to know that I need my next race. So I always have races booked out a year in advance. So that's what's getting me up. I have the next race. Then I got the next race to do, And I learned that my first Ironman, because that was my big goal, was to get an Ironman out of the way. And I thought it was going to be a bucket. Turned out it would be one of 5. But when I did it the next week, and I talked to all my first timers, I'm like, you're going to get the Ironman blues because they had this big bucket list to go after, right? And then they finish it. And a lot of times they're like, I think that's it. I'm done. I don't want to do it anymore. And then I was great. I loved it, blah, blah, blah. And then the next day they're sore, they're feeling good, blah, blah, blah. Then the next day their eyes wake up at the normal time that they've been waking up. And they're like, okay, oh, well, I don't have to work out. I don't have to wake up and work out because I have anything left. I'm like, and then maybe they'll get up and just have a cup of coffee and just enjoy it. Or they'll be like, I don't have a purpose.
Right. Yeah. That's tough.
That's the Ironman blues. So that's how I learned that never, ever not have another race on the books. Even if you've planned out that I'm going to take a month off and I'm just going to just run for giggles. I'm going to bike for giggles. I'm going to swim for giggles. I'm going to be in the gym just to F around. Yeah. And that's fine for a month. But then when the next month comes in, you're like, all right, time to get back to work. So that's my biggest thing is go after something you never thought that you would ever do. Like I tell people, look, turn on the television and if you see stuff, like I got one guy was like, and I couldn't help him because I wasn't up to it at that point, but he's like, you know what? I'm going to go and see if I can get on American Ninja Warrior. Never did anything in the gym, never did any of that stuff.
Whoa.
He says, I'm going to go find, and I said, and what we did is we hunkered down and we researched it and we found a gym that got people ready for that, had a gym that had obstacle courses that would teach you how to do the obstacles. And a lot of people went there for fitness and for fun. And then there's people that really wanted to get on the show. But those are things that will turn your life around in ways you never thought possible. I'll never forget the first time I jumped out of an airplane. Yeah. I'm like, there is nothing like it in the world. And the fact that there's no way that the human body should jump out of a plane at 6,000 feet and fly and jump down, or 3,500 feet. And when you get to basically what they tell you is that 1,000 feet, like 500 feet, that's when you pull the ripcord, and you got to know when to pull that ripcord. Otherwise you're not surviving. But usually the first one is tandem. So it's somebody else pulling the ripcord, right? I'll never forget that. It's after that day, it was like any obstacle that came up, I'd be like, oh man, I got to do this again, or I can't get this. And then my mind would go back. I'm like, hey, you jumped out of a perfectly good airplane and survived. What can't you do?
That's right. That's right.
And that's what I tell as a coach, I become not only coach, friend, therapist, people bounce things off of me. I don't want to say doctor. I'm the guy you go to before the doctor to say, go to the doctor. And I become that person. And the number of times is like, I would be able to sit there and say, dude, you did an Ironman. You crossed the finish line of one of the hardest competitions in the world. Why can't you do this piddly little thing? And most of the time, 99% of the time, it's like, I get this reaction. Huh. Yeah. Yeah. I'm an Ironman. And that's what I really love people doing. People like you write books. Like you get to this thing, you write a book. You wrote a book. How many people write a book? And as many as there's out there, it's still a very small percentage of the people that will actually sit down and write a book.
Yeah.
That's huge. So, and I think that people, they don't realize some of the accomplishments that they have is all they have to do is look back on and go, I did that. There's no reason I can't do this.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that I've learned this year, I turned 50 this year, and one thing that was unexpected, but also magical at the same time is there's something about that crossing that threshold. And you think to yourself, it's not really similar to the airplane analogy because you actually did that. You did that on purpose. And if you turn a certain age, you maybe or maybe didn't do that on purpose. Who knows? But it's the feeling of nothing's killed me yet. So why should I be afraid to go out here and take this risk? And I felt that on such a deep level. I had a couple of things come just earlier this year that normally like 5 years ago would have had me spinning, like stressed out, trying to figure out, okay, how I'm going to figure this thing out. How am I going to fix it? And I was just like, okay, cool. It was not great news. It was bad news. It was going to cost a ton of money. And someone looked at me and said, why are you not freaking out about this? I'm like, it'll be fine. I'll do what has to get done, but getting worked up over it is not going to move me in that direction. And part of that's the Stoicism, but also part of that's just, hey, I've been around for a minute and nothing's killed me yet. So it's probably going to work out okay. And if it doesn't, well, lessons will be learned. So,
you know what? That is monstrous.
It's huge.
Hey, I've been around this long and nothing's killed me yet. What makes me think this frickin' obstacle is going to do anything worse?
Yeah.
That is a brilliant. Because I can look at my parents now, right? I remember I was doing the Chicago Marathon. I lived in Chicago for a very long time. My parents just moved here 2 years ago. So usually what would happen is I did the Chicago Marathon like 6 times. And this was like I think it was the time before the last. And usually what would happen is I'd go in 2 days early. I'd spend a couple days with my parents. And then I'd go up to Chicago because they live in the suburbs. I go to Chicago and I get my hotel room, spend the night, run the race, and then go home the next day. And that was it. Well, something happened. I didn't have as much time this time because of work. And I'm like, hey, why don't this time, instead of me coming down home, why don't you come up to the city and I'll take you guys out for dinner and really nice restaurant downtown. And growing up, my dad always talked about, as a driver, is being aggressively defensive. And he could whip around Chicago like you wouldn't believe. Like he knew ins and outs. He was the freaking in, out, blah, 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 got around, never had a problem. It was always, for using your word, stoic. You're like,
yeah.
Okay, great. Blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden I got in the car with them. Well, first of all, they were late and they gave me a call like, oh, Brad, sorry, we just got into a little fender bender. We'll call you when we get done with the ticket and all that stuff. And I was like, uh-oh. So now I get in the car with him. Now my dad's like all the way on the right-hand side and he needs to get over into the next lane over and he stops. That was one thing he always told me growing up. He's like, if you're driving, he says, you never stop. You always keep going and merge in. And he stopped. And I was like, oh, and that was the first time I realized my parents were getting old.
Yeah.
Because my dad was always like he's my hero, still is my hero. Right. But at that point, he's still 10 feet tall and bulletproof.
Sure.
At that time. And then that turned the corner to where oh my God, they're starting to get a little older. But I wish, and that's one way that most people age, is not thinking, oh, I've been through 50, 60, 70 years of life. It hasn't killed me yet.
Right.
I love that. But most people are the opposite. All right, well, my body's not as good as it used to be, and I'm get sick easier and blah, 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 and I don't have that many days left, so I want to make sure that I live them and I'm safe. I'm going to go your route. Your route.
It's been fun so far.
Yeah. No, I love that. So, listen, just that is amazing, and I think that's powerful. And I think any of you out there that take anything away from this, I think that is the one piece of information that you should take. He talked about a bunch of different things, James said. He talked about journaling. He talked about morning routines. He talked about coffee, which is very important. And so it's great. Now, his podcast is located, and he has his URL for that is joyfulrebellion.com. And like you said, he's got a few episodes in 2023, and then he really got serious February 25th of 2024, which is where this podcast started to getting serious too. So you'll notice that. So if you want to go back, look at back on both of them. And so he has that. And remember, he's got the motivations of the meditation of the mundane, and that's out. Is that on Amazon?
It's not on Amazon. I went to a private publisher just to be able to get the coffee table book the size I wanted.
Yeah.
Amazon doesn't print that size. So it's available on my website.
On
It'll
Joyful
be,
Rebellion?
it's actually going to be linked in about a week from A Joyful Rebellion to my publishing website.
All right, great. So that's great. So that's going to happen for all of you. That will, by time this goes live, that'll happen, because this probably won't go live until second week in February. So that'll be already taken care of. So go to A Joyful Rebellion. You'll see that link. And then hopefully maybe he'll even have his new book, Plotting Your Joyful Rebellion. And that will, he says, it will assist you on your mission to get more of your life. So go ahead and check that out as well. That'll also be on unjoyfulrebellion.com. And that's actually, it's already there now. It says it's going to be ready, but by the time this goes live, hopefully it will be ready. And then keep taking a look at the podcast. And he's also got a way for you to be right there, be a guest on his podcast. So take a look at that as well. So that would be amazing. So Joyful Rebellion. And then you are on a couple of socials. It looks like you're on Facebook and Instagram.
We do those. I do.
So take a look at those. Those will be linked. The Joyful Rebellion will be linked. The book will be linked. All that stuff will be linked in the show notes. So take a look at that. And James, it's been amazing. It's been wonderful. And I hope we get to do this again.
I know, Brad. Thank you so much for having me. This has been one of the best conversations I've had in a very long time. So thank you.
Same here. It's been awesome. It's been absolutely awesome. And the similarities are redonkulous. But I appreciate it. So for myself and for James, I appreciate you guys all listening. Again, if you're looking on YouTube, please go ahead and hit the like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you always know when the new episode is coming up. If you're on Apple or Spotify, please consider leaving a review, even if it's a bad review, because that just means I get to learn something and we evolve the podcast. So for James and myself, thank you, and we'll see you in the next one. Well, that wraps up another episode of Life-Changing Challengers. I'm your host, Brad Minus, saying thank you for joining us on this journey of transformation. If today's stories inspired you, please take a moment to review, share, and follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Your support helps us reach more listeners and create an even bigger impact. Remember, every challenge is a chance to grow. Until next time, keep pushing, keep challenging, and never stop pursuing your extraordinary.